group incentive schemes have risen in popularity as organisations have focused attention on the importance of teams and team working. That there has been a gradual awareness of the illogicality of attempting to encourage team-based performance in organisations, which seems an increasingly important thing, whilst focusing attention and rewards on individuals. So organisations see the development of team-based rewards, of team incentives, group incentives, as something which may naturally reflect the kinds of workflow, the kinds of cooperative working arrangements that they would like to encourage. And so there's a congruency, a good fit between these kinds of approaches. This is the kind of reward that may encourage the types of behaviour that they increasingly see as being important and useful to them. Now, when we say team, we often imagine a relatively small group, and team incentives, group incentives can be focused at that level. But the idea of a group incentive might be applied anywhere between, or be focused around anything in between that relatively small group, right up to the level of the whole organisation. And so we can think about the different kinds of approaches that we use in terms of how it reflects the performance of those elements of the organisation, those collective units of the organisation in different ways, and how useful those different elements, those different groups within organisations, even if that's the whole organisation itself, how useful those are in terms of directing the attention of individuals within them. So it may well be seen as an important aspect of how we want people to work. That if we want an orientation around a team, around a group, then it seems natural to reward that group for their success. That we, that in very simplistic terms, we want that kind of behaviour. We want successful groups. We want people to work hard and cooperate together, and so we reward them in that way. It may also be that we want people to identify with the whole organisation. But we want that to encourage that kind of unitarist identification of employees with the organisations that they work for. And so that sharing the success of an organisation, that if the organisation as a whole does well, then everybody should do well, is part of that philosophical idea that we're all part of this bigger thing, that we all have the same interests, that financially our interests are aligned. It's not us against them, it's all of us together, and that if we do well as a company, then we share that throughout the organisation. Now, just as we've seen with some individual approaches towards incentives, there are similar difficulties that we identify in terms of creating that link between what a team or a group does and how we reward them effectively, and that some of those problems are bound up with how we effectively measure the performance of those teams. That all of a sudden, because we're dealing not in terms of what have you done, but in terms of what have we done, then the relationship between what have I done and what has my contribution to the team been, and what has the team done, become problematic. That it raises all kinds of difficult questions, because it's not always easy to disentangle what the contribution of various team or group members has been to the overall achievement of the team in question. So this becomes, exacerbated the bigger the team or the bigger the group that you're thinking about. So The biggest teams that we usually look at are the organisation as a whole, and team incentives in this form are things like profit sharing or profit-related pay. Now, if you're a relatively small organisation, then you may well be able to trace through the relationship between what you do on a day-to-day basis or over the course of a period of time and the success of an organisation. And if you're relatively senior, that line of sight between your contribution and the outcome of the whole group is relatively straightforward. But in a big organisation, particularly if you're fairly low down in the hierarchy, the line of sight gets obscured. It's not always easy to see what your contribution has been, and that for some people within the group, it becomes really quite difficult that that if they don't contribute directly to the measures that we use, typically profit or some kind of financial measure of success, then if you're involved in some kind of process activity rather than a revenue-raising activity, then how is that determined? How is your relationship to that group output determined? How can you see what you do? How does it have the kind of incentivizing or motivational impact that you would want it to have if it's actually going to serve its purpose as a useful mechanism to encourage certain kinds of behaviours and be strategic in that way. So some of the innovations that we've seen in this area are to broaden the definition of what success at group level means, particularly these bigger organisational level groups. So things like Kaplan and Norton's balanced scorecard model, which allows a broader view of what organisational success means, allows an easier identification of contribution at the individual level to those group outcomes. More generally, the problems associated with the relationship between individuals and groups, when we start to try and reward people on that basis, are bound up with the problems of free riding. This issue of free riding, where individual members of a group don't contribute, that some people do so much more than others, and that becomes an issue once we start rewarding people on the basis of group success rather than on individual contribution to that group. This has become an ongoing issue. Now we know that free riding at a common sense level is a terrible thing, and we all hate it, and it's incredibly irritating. But there is an argument to say that free riding, in the context of generally available rewards for group activity, is entirely natural and rational. Manka Olson, economist, famously talks about the rationality of free rider behaviour. And so this becomes just an ongoing problem that's built into the very basis of the design of these kinds of approaches. How can we deal with free riders? It's natural that some people, given the existence of public goods, that rewards that are available generally within this group, it makes sense for people to kind of hide and do as little as possible and then just enjoy the success of the group as a whole. So how do you overcome that? How do you deal with those kinds of problems if they're not going to undermine the basis of the reward altogether? Now, most approaches towards dealing with free riders in this kind of situation has been focused around the idea that groups should or will naturally attempt to police themselves, because we're all irritated by free riders in this kind of situation. The more that we can strengthen group norms, group values that discourage this kind of free riding activity, then that's an appropriate way to deal with it. That we both strengthen those group norms, that identification of the group, and that we're all responsible to the group, and then effectively allow the group to police itself. so that free riders are rooted out by colleagues. It's not a management activity, it becomes a function of group behaviour. We can also attempt to develop maybe more sophisticated performance measures that can discourage free riding as well. But generally, this normative approach, this idea that groups can police themselves and that they can ferret out free riders and deal with that problem in itself. Now, another way that organisations have dealt with the line of sight problem, this idea that if we're too far away from the outcome that generates the reward, then the kind of motivational impact gets diluted or lost, are gain sharing approaches. This is a largely American innovation. In the UK, we've generally seen them as kind of productivity deals, where there is that the measure of group success at the level of the organisation isn't based upon some broad measure like profit or whatever, but they're more finely drawn so that they can be associated with the impact of employees, rather than the kind of wider set of variables that affect things like profit. Because profit is affected by the things out of employee control, like things that happen in the supply chain, about the cost of raw materials, about currency fluctuations, about import-export tariffs, all of these kinds of things that are just outside of what employees are capable of having any influence over. And so if you take those things as the measure of success, and all of the other variables act against that, you can be working as hard as you like, and the outcome is still no good, and so there's no reward to be shared. With gain sharing, the measures of success strip away all of those extraneous variables. They just focus in on the kinds of things that employees have some control over. It's no surprise, given that these types of rewards are often associated with the presence of unions, and that some of these plans were the brainchild of union negotiators. So, for example, the Scanlon plan, which is a form of gain sharing, the measure of the gain is a productivity gain, effectively. It's about the reduction in payroll costs against net sales. So the more revenue that's produced versus the payroll, so how much more productive each member of staff has become, that becomes the measure of the gain. The InpraShare plan works in a similar way, but it's based around the ratio of working hours against output. The Rooker plan looks at reduction in payroll costs against value added. And more recently, we've seen more sophisticated multi-factor models, which attempt to incorporate more sophisticated qualitative measures of gain, like customer satisfaction, quality standards, and so on. So that these are seen as quite sophisticated and flexible approaches towards group incentives that have some prospects for success. And not only is the actual design of the scheme important, but the fact that these are often based around or based upon extensive organisational cooperation with unions and through them with the workforce, that they seem to have a degree of stability and strength to them that is based around those employment relations processes. Final approach towards group incentive plans or longer term incentive plans. Now, we mentioned profit sharing, but another approach that we've seen organisations make use of are share ownership schemes. Now, these are as their name suggests, they're longer-term incentive plans. They're not, let's take a snapshot of what's happened this year, or the next year, or whenever, and then they'll apply a bonus of some kind. But they're designed to develop a kind of longer-term orientation towards the organisation by extending ownership rights to the workforce as part and parcel of that, in many ways, mirroring the approach of executive share option schemes. And the idea is that it provides the basis of non-zero sum game outcomes in rewards, that as the organisation becomes more valuable, that some of that value through share ownership can be passed on to employees, so that employees are able to enrich themselves without that resulting in a direct transfer of organisational resources from the organisation to the workforce. Now, of course, there is some dilution of share ownership as part of that, but the benefits of that, the development of an ownership culture, that we're all in this together, that generates greater willingness to work, be on contract, a greater commitment, greater engagement, greater sense of this is my thing, our thing, not your thing, is seen as an important benefit. Generation of commitment, the ability to recruit scarce staff sometimes when maybe we're not able to be as generous in other reward elements. These things are very important. Retention, longevity of service, pay flexibility, strong, important organisational benefits from these kinds of long-term incentive plans.